This lecture is Chapter 10 on intelligence, problem solving, and creativity. So first let's look at intelligence and let's define intelligence. It is a set of cognitive skills that includes abstract thinking, reasoning, problem solving, and the ability to acquire knowledge. Although we know there are several different theories regarding the concept of intelligence. So it's hard to put it into one definition because there's several theories that are mentioned in the book. And also, I included on this slide several different theories. I think the chart offers a good summary of those theories and things to consider about those different theories of what intelligence is. I'm not going to go through the whole chart, but be sure and check that out and look at each of those theories. One theory was developed by Gardner. He had an idea of multiple intelligences, that there's not just one strict definition of intelligence, but that there's multiple types. For example, some people may have intrapersonal intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, mathematical skills. So there's different types of intelligence that each of us might have. I think it's a great theory that really points out that all of us are probably intelligent in some way. It just may be different from the norm. So how is intelligence measured? We know what intelligence is, but how do we measure it? Alfred Binet created the first true test of intelligence. He created a test which compared a child's mental age to their chronological age, and that's how he came up with a number. In the mid-1900s, David Wechsler developed the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale and the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. These are probably the most widely used scales today. However, they're a little bit different. The newest versions don't just focus on one dimension of intelligence. Similar to Gardner, they look at 4 different dimensions. They look at your verbal comprehension, your perceptual reasoning, your working memory, and your processing speed. So how valid and reliable are IQ tests? Do they really measure what we think they measure? Reliability essentially means how consistent are the results. If someone takes the same test twice, are the results the same? For example, if someone gets a 100 on one test and an 80 on another test, you're probably going to think, oh, okay, maybe these results aren't too reliable. Maybe they're not measuring what we think they are. But if someone gets a 100 on one test and a 95 on another test, you might think, okay, this is a pretty reliable test. It's measuring what we think it is. Speaking of measuring what we think it is, that's validity. Does the test really measure intelligence, or does it measure something else? That's much harder to determine than reliability. Reliability, all we have to do is look and see if the results are consistent. Validity is, like I said, a little bit harder. Does it really measure what we think it is? So are IQ tests biased? I'm not going to say too much about this question since this is part of your week 9 writing assignment, but be sure and check out the textbook, what it says on IQ test bias, and also I included some articles with the assignment that should give you a better idea of how IQ tests might be biased. The bell curve of intelligence, which is pretty commonly known, it just gives an average of different people of the whole population's IQ. As you can see, the majority of the population is between 70 and 130. 68% of the population is between 85 and 115, and so on. You can see that a very small amount of the population is above 145. So this is kind of how we look at what the average intelligence of the population is. So intelligence, is it caused by nature or is it nurture? We've asked this question before on other things. Is it genetics or is it your environment? Recent research reveals that people with higher levels of brain connectivity tend to have higher overall IQs. Well, brain connectivity is how much you're stimulated by your environment, so that would be nurture. So we found that, again, higher levels of brain connectivity tend to equal a higher IQ, But also, higher IQ equals higher levels of brain connectivity. So we don't really know which one comes first, the nature or the nurture. It probably goes both ways. So again, let's look further at nurture. What parts of the environment affect the IQ? We obviously know there's genetic factors, there's nature, but also a stimulating environment in the home and in the schools, which would be how much relate to the brain connectivity. Also, your health, your socioeconomic status, achievement motivation, your academic development, adjustment. So many things go into your IQ besides just your genetics. Let's look at problem solving. In problem solving, there's a use of algorithms, which is a step-by-step procedure or formula for solving a problem. For example, if I mow my yard once per week and want to know how many times I mow my yard per year, I would multiply one time per week, times 52 weeks per year equals 52. So there's a logical formula and an algorithm for solving that problem. I might have a eureka insight, a sudden solution that comes to mind in a flash. I'm trying to solve a problem, and often people will say, I had an epiphany and I knew the solution. Thinking outside the box means you're thinking about a problem differently in order to solve it. You're reaching beyond what you would normally do to try and solve a problem. Some more terms related to that, related to problem solving, are fixation, which is essentially the inability to think outside the box. Mental set, which means you continue using problem solving techniques that worked in the past instead of considering new possibilities, which also is an inability to think outside the box and think beyond what you've previously done. Functional fixedness is also, again, not willing to think outside the box, specifically regarding alternate uses for everyday things and procedures. In other words, how could I do this differently? How could I use this differently? Really, just an inability to think outside the box is a huge part of not being able to solve problems. So, creativity in problem solving. Let's define creativity. Creativity is a thought or behavior that is both novel or original and meaningful. It's useful. So there are 4 stages of creative problem solving. The preparation stage would be discovering and defining the problem. Incubation would be putting the problem aside and working on something else. In other words, let the problem sink in. Give your brain time to process the problem while you're doing something else. Insight, again, an epiphany or a eureka moment when the solution comes to mind. And then elaboration, verification, confirmation that the solution will work. So that's it for intelligence, problem solving, and creativity. Hopefully that gave you a good summary of each. If you have questions, feel free to ask me, read your textbook to kind of get a little more detail. I don't mind at all to help.